This is Tech Pathways Unlocked, the podcast that delves deep into the journeys of some of the industry's top leaders. We speak with innovators, pioneers, and visionaries to uncover the stories behind their success, the challenges they've overcome, and the passions that drive them on. Whether you're an aspiring tech leader or a seasoned professional, our goal is to inspire and empower you with insights and advice from those who have navigated the complex landscape of technology to reach the very top. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Stopford Recruitment, where your growth is our commitment. Tune in and let's unlock your pathway to success. Today, I am delighted to be joined by James Cullen, an experienced software engineering leader. James, delighted to have you on the podcast, mate. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much, Ollie. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, how I start the podcast is just asking you to give a bit of an intro to yourself, if possible.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, great. So, as you say, Ollie, I've been a software engineering leader now for the last couple of years. Started my career in tech only 10 years ago. I was a career switcher. I had an idea for an app 10 years ago, managed to get some angel funding as a non-technical founder. Got quite frustrated, but at the same time interested in the tech. And so I actually enrolled myself on a boot camp with an academy called IO Academy, which is based in Bath, Bristol, Bath area. And never really looked back, to be honest. Became far more interested in the tech than I did in my own startup. So that ground to a halt. And then I got a job with a scale-up, which was absolutely fantastic for my development. Became a Java software engineer. And then I got a break in 2020 when I joined Deloitte and their TechWorks group in Bristol. And I went from software engineering consultant to senior consultant and then to manager in quite quick succession. And that's kind of led me to where I am today.
Great overview, thank you. And I think it's interesting because you've gone from obviously getting back into the industry, a career change, going through a scale up and then to a big corporation firm. You've obviously gone through a lot of changes. You've seen a lot of different environments, which I think could help you, form the leader you are today as well, which is interesting. I suppose, would you say there's a particular moment, mentor or project, maybe early in your career or at some point so far, like you say, 10 years, still loads and loads and loads of potential there. Do you think there's been a moment where, it shaped your leader today, the leader you are today, sorry?
I think there's been a number, Ollie. I think there's probably three kind of key leaders that I've had, or mentors, if you will, throughout this journey. And I think I could track it back to them in how they've helped to shape me as the leader I am today. And I think if I was to pull out kind of certain traits of those leaders, the one that sticks in my mind is humility. I think I've been very fortunate to be around some wonderful people in software, mainly software engineering directors, head of software engineering, lead engineers. And I think humility is really important. The best leaders that I've been working with are those who are always learning. They always have a growth mindset. They are willing to learn from others, regardless of grade. And they're also the first ones to put the hand up and admit when they're wrong and they've made a mistake. And by doing so, they lead by example. So I think one trait really, I think, must be top of the pile is humility. And the other is vulnerability. Their willingness to be vulnerable and open, to be able to say and sit, and say, actually, I don't understand this, but I want to learn more. And I think that, especially in software engineering, is really important. We're all on a journey whereby we are spending our entire career learning. It moves so fast, especially at the moment, that we have to be vulnerable and we have to have that humility. We have to appreciate and sit there that actually we're never going to know it all. Far from it.
I like that. I like that approach. And do you think that's something that's stuck with you throughout, your time, for example, at Deloitte and before then?
Yeah, absolutely, Ollie. And I think it gives people permission to do the same, to ask for help. We can all talk about psychological safety in teams, and it's a really big thing. And I think for any organization, one thing that is important for software engineers, I believe, is a culture of having psychological safety. And that's one thing that's probably not talked about enough, especially during recruitment stages. The reason why I think it's important is because with software engineering, it can be a very vulnerable place to be, and it can be a very lonely place to be. Sometimes you're hanging your hat on the code that you produce, on the architecture that you design, and then it's reviewed. And at times that can be, a really difficult place to be. If you foster a culture of psychological safety, because by leaders leading by example and showing that actually they can make mistakes and they're happy to make mistakes, and then iterate, change, and go again. I think that's really important for everybody else around them.
That's a really good take on it, and I think that leads me on to the next question is in terms of like if there was some core principles and philosophies that guide you as a leader. I take it that is probably definitely right up there. Is there anything else that you really grow into a team that you lead? Again, going back to the time at Deloitte and then obviously future positions, is there something that you really embed within your way as a leader?
Yeah, so I think once we've established a culture of psychological safety, that's kind of the framework and the bedrock and the fundamentals of the team. Excuse me. And that becomes your ways of working, your way of working and your approach to things. Once we've got that, it's also very important to be decisive. So what you want in a leader, and I think the best leaders that I've been around, they are willing to make decisions when it matters. The most important thing about that, Ollie, is taking everybody else with you on that journey. So, so long as we're all facing the same direction, and we all go in that direction, even if we don't agree necessarily. If it's the wrong direction, then that's fine. We'll all admit, we'll all hold our hands up, we'll regroup, and we'll go again. We'll pivot and we'll try something else. But I think it's fine not to agree in a team, but it's also really important to make a decision. I think in software engineering, because of the agile methodology, sometimes it's been abused in a way, actually, by a lot of software engineers, to allow them to be somewhat more experimental with things, and that's fine. That's great. It's really important to bring new things in and to try different things. That should absolutely be encouraged and embraced. But ultimately, as an organization, we also want to see deliverables. We want to see results. That's what we're getting paid for. And I think that's really important. And to do that, we need to make a decision. And I think really good leaders are excellent at being able to strike a balance between, encouraging the team to be autonomous, to have that kind of independence, but equally being able to make a decision whereby everyone else is going to follow.
Brilliant. And when we started speaking about you coming on this podcast, I'd read the article that I think you posted it on LinkedIn about your journey from startup founder, and then obviously getting into the industry to now software engineer manager. A really interesting read, which, if you don't mind, I can obviously pin it to this podcast when it gets released. But obviously, when you started and got into the industry, the tech industry through Maiden Academy, like I've seen a lot of individuals take that route, which I think is a really innovative approach to getting into the industry, and I love it. How did you find sourcing a new role from there, was there any support that you got from, I think it's called IO Academy now, isn't it? Like, is there any support that you get from them when you're sourcing your first sort of like full position? And have you ever like experienced negative feedback as a result of it? For example, rather than going through university, grad, then into a sort of first graduate position, this is the sort of like other way in, isn't it, if you will? Have you ever experienced like anything, any sort of like drawbacks, setbacks from that? I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people will take a lot from this. And I think if we can sort of like unwrap that, I think it'll help a lot of people to give them advice on what to do in that situation.
Ollie, it's an absolutely fantastic question, and it's a brave question as well because it doesn't get spoken about enough
Yeah.
in the industry. I think there was definitely a negative association with career switchers and people who'd gone into boot camps, coding boot camps, and I think that's because obviously historically it's been more of a classical route, as you say, through a computer science degree and then into industry. Um, Fortunately, I've managed to surround myself with some fantastic people
Yeah.
who really don't care about the details of how you ended up in the industry or how you got here. What they're more interested in is where you're going to go in the industry. Like what you can achieve together. So I think, but the truth is, yes, Ollie, it is difficult. So if there's somebody out there now who's graduated, through a non-conventional path, even
Mm.
self-taught, I think they can also have a really tough challenge compared to having a degree against your name, such as a computer
Yeah.
science degree. I think there is definitely a slight a stigma, if you will, to that because it's a bit of an unknown quantity.
Yeah.
So the answer, yes, I have definitely seen that. And when I first began applying for roles on the back of IO Academy, I started to apply 2 weeks before I graduated.
Okay.
And there was a fantastic recruitment agency local to Bristol, who I really liked. They'd been into the academy, which was great. They were a partner of the academy, and they had some really fantastic roles. And I remember having a very frustrating conversation with a recruiter from that company, and trying to argue my case really as to why I should be put forward. Now, recruiters are in an incredibly difficult position because essentially, if it's prescribed by an organization that somebody needs a certain amount of experience in industry, it's very difficult then for graduates, do you know what I mean, to sort of bypass that without the experience. And as for many different industries, it's a bit chicken and egg, until someone gives you that chance, you can't get the experience. What I would say is that, software is a skill, and that's a really great thing. It's a skill. And those organizations who put energy and time into recruitment are going to be able to find that actually it really does not matter. You can have a conventional path and you can have people with degrees. Equally, you could have people who are self-taught or been on a coding boot camp. Those who are actively interested in software development and those who have a real kind of tenacity for it, those are the ones who perform the best. And the beauty is that's testable, Ollie. That is testable. That's why we have technical interviews. And that's why it's worth an organization's time to see, okay, how do these people learn? How do the applicants actually learn, and how do they deal with problems? How do they look to solve problems? Look at a bigger picture. What's really great is, again, coming back to the best mentors and best leaders that I've worked with, they have all actively encouraged a pathway for people from different backgrounds and people who got into the industry in different ways. They've always tried to balance the team with people who've, self-taught, maybe come from degrees and also boot camps. They've got a pathway for juniors because they know that the beauty is with software, there's not just one way to solve a problem. That's a really important thing. There's 10, 20, 100 different ways to solve the same problem. And the beauty is being able to create a team whereby you've got a breadth of different people with creative ideas as to how to solve the problem. And I think, and again as well, I think anyone out there who is graduating and anyone who is really finding it tough to try to break into that and get that experience that they need, I would really say that just keep going, that it's about the people. It's finding those leaders who are pragmatic enough to realize actually, skill can be learned, like coding can be taught, especially now with AI. The skill of coding itself from scratch is no longer a must have. The most important thing is the tenacity that somebody has to solve a problem.
It's so refreshing to hear that, because I think that a lot of people have gone through that same experience and had either a positive or negative experience from it. And I think, some of that feedback that you gave then, in terms of, you know, skills can be taught, providing you've got the right attitude to be able to deliver and learn. Individuals that are going through applications at the moment in this very rapidly changing and challenging job market, that's some really good advice, I feel, that can help them, sort of take a step back when things aren't going to plan. You might be getting setback after setback after setback. And in any industry, we're not just talking about tech, remaining persistent with your end goal and understanding why are you doing that, why are you applying for this job, I think is really important. So appreciate it. It is quite a touchy subject, and I really appreciate you going into that. I think it could be really helpful for others. So I remember speaking about a program that you did, which has helped you become a better leader to date. Can you go into that for us and just sort of give some insight to it?
Yeah, of course. When I was at Deloitte, I was very fortunate that we had a great training budget. And of course, I think a lot of people, maybe who are working in industry or looking for roles at the moment, it's very difficult to compete,
Yeah.
with the big corporates when it comes to things like learning budgets. However, I would love to talk about how actually there's a way to work around that, I think.
Yeah.
For me, I'm very fortunate. Deloitte invested heavily in learning and development. And one of the courses that I went on was called an engineering leadership program. It was run by Makers Academy, who are, another and one of the biggest boot camp academies out there. They also do continuous professional development, such as the course that we had.
Yeah.
So it was bespoke and it was absolutely fantastic. And we covered different modules such as building a high performing team, architecting a solution, and quality first, which are all absolutely fantastic. I think principles and areas of engineering that software engineers probably need to go from working in a team to leading a team. However, I think one of the most surprising things that I took away from it, Ollie, and I think the most valuable part of that course was time spent with my peers. Okay. So it was time spent with my peers in small groups, talking about and sharing problems that we came across in day-to-day work.
Yeah.
And then challenging each other to think about, creative solutions to those problems. Now, those problems could have been anything from, people problems, which is it, always takes up a huge amount of energy for any team. Working with other people, collaborating with other people, especially in software when maybe we have different ways of working. Or it could be a technical problem. It could literally be like a bigger picture architectural problem. And we'd share this in a safe space whereby we knew it was confidential. And I think actually the one thing that we needed then, which we were fortunate to have, was a facilitator. But it acted, Ollie, almost like a mastermind group. Okay. And I think it is incredibly valuable. And I really think that if, although the content of the course was absolutely first class, and I got a great deal out of that. Actually, I think the most valuable thing to take away, and something that I think we could replicate, okay, with others, is actually to facilitate small group peer-to-peer sessions, mastermind style, okay, whereby people get to share in a safe space. And I think it's done really well in other industries, but for whatever reason, I just don't feel like the software industries really embrace that. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we could explore. And I think that something for the people you work with, Ollie, I think that could be a very valuable thing.
A potential collaboration point for me and yourself there, James, maybe. You never know. I like that approach. And I think that, you are right. Having that ability to sit down in an open space that is secure and, 3, 4, 5, 6 people just talking about certain trends and their qualities and advice and tips for success and navigating challenges can really make the difference, which if someone, and you're right, this is why, and I speak about this every single day when facilitating job searches and speaking to candidates for roles that are with startups and scale-ups that I work within, comparing that to maybe big tech interviews that they've got going on as well, applications, sorry. You mentioned then about the training budget, the development budget that Deloitte offer, which is fantastic. That is probably one of the biggest benefits that a lot of big techs can offer compared to startups and scale-ups. If someone isn't in that fortunate position where they have that available to have, what can other aspiring leaders do if they don't have the opportunity to take up that program, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. So I think first and foremost, there's advantages to both.
Yeah.
So one advantage when we're in a smaller organization is, by its very nature, especially in software, you're probably going to have greater opportunity to get involved in different things, so you're going to have the opportunity to learn and be exposed to different facets of software on the job.
Yeah.
Also, you could actually be working in smaller, tight-knit teams whereby you have a closer mentorship, which in itself is learning and development. The larger firms, although of course you will have formal mentor programs, you will have availability to coaching, a lot of the time, sadly, of course, they will take a back seat to client-facing work. And your client-facing work might be, by its nature, very niche, very narrow, and you might be on that for a substantial period of time. And so I think there's pros and cons to both in terms of actually actively learning on the job, as you are. But if we think about real training and development, I think first and foremost, as I say, there's nothing stopping any of us from creating small groups, like I suggested in terms of a mastermind, and carving out time to sit in a safe space, even just for an hour a week, and say, do you know what, we're going to come up with a theme. We're going to do a round robin, and each person each week is going to bring a problem to the table, and we're just going to bash it out. We're going to bring our laptops and we're going to, challenge each other, and we're going to deep dive into it. I think that's really important. I think time and space is really encouraged. Of course, though, Ollie, like people work and learn in different ways.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I'm very conscious of. I'm very visceral. I'm very kinesthetic. Like I love to actually learn as I do. If you gave me something to read, I'd really struggle.
Yeah.
So I think again, the advantages of being in a smaller company to a larger is that instead of having a really slick, off the shelf, albeit bespoke coaching program, that might not be the best for everyone. Jumping on a call for 2 hours on a Friday might not actually work for a lot of people. They actually might prefer to go away and learn in their own time, watch videos, like read articles. And so I think, as I say, there's that pros and cons. And I think looking at the smaller things, looking at like lack of budget, well, there might be a lack of budget, but actually there might be more space and time.
Yeah.
You know, you might more easily be able to ask for a little bit like, you know, the Google analogy of having a 20% time, you know, having that Friday afternoon to go and explore something you're interested in, you know. I think that time and space is probably more valuable sometimes to many of us than the training budget itself.
Yeah, no, that's inspiring. That I think, yeah, I agree. If more and more people can get together to do that, I think it can really go a long way to helping, you know, everybody involved in that situation. So we've obviously briefly touched about it in terms of skills can be taught, and providing you have that right attitude and you know, mindset to do that, you know, you can achieve anything you want. What would you say, and it's a two-part question, this, because it's based on an individual and then a company. In terms of the individual question first, what do you think holds individuals back in engineering from succeeding in engineering within their career?
Yeah, fantastic question. I think there's no straight answer to this. I think, you know, there's no one thing.
Yeah, we could be here all day.
Yeah, right, we could be. But to try and keep it succinct, maybe I could give you three, you know, three examples that I see. I think first and foremost is visibility.
Yeah.
You know, there's no two ways about this. I think it is easier in software, especially as a technical contributor. It is easier in software to be invisible to lots of the leadership team than it is in other sectors and other industries. So I think visibility can hold people back, and that's a real shame. So one thing that really helped me and that I was mentored on was ways in which you can increase your visibility. Be that, for example, your digital visibility. So very simple things, you know, as a software engineer, your job is not simply just to write code and ship it. You know, the most important thing, I would argue, is communication. That's communicating with the other teams around you, product, design, infrastructure. And I think that gives you opportunity to become more visible. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, lots of people will be uncomfortable with that. I think the nature of what we do is that lots of us like to be individual contributors. But I think in terms of visibility, that can be in different ways, Ollie. So it could be, for example, just, you know, asking a question on a ticket, you know, writing in a text box and, you know, hooking someone in. Maybe writing, you know, a message in an open forum, you know, maybe like in a Slack channel. Whereas, you know, you would normally maybe do that in a closed group. Maybe actually, you know, it's encouraging the conversation with others in a way that you feel comfortable. So I think, yeah, number one's visibility. I think number two, the things that hold people back are just coming all the way back to that vulnerability and humility. I think just, you know, the you know, being okay with making mistakes. You know what I mean? Like, you know, just being vulnerable, being open. Like, you know, like it's an older age and it sounds quite quirky and people like to kind of quote it, you know, like fail fast, break things. But I think in software, there is a bit of truth in that. You know, I think essentially we are going to make mistakes, and I think we mustn't, you know, be scared of that. I think actually we can just, it's always an opportunity to be accountable and then to fix them and remedy them. Do you know what I mean? And that's how we kind of develop and grow.
Learning from them. So, you know, I remember when I first started out in recruitment, making mistakes is good because you can allow yourself to learn from those mistakes rather than get yourself bogged down. I can imagine it's the same, excuse me, in engineering or in any industry. If you make the mistake, great, you're doing something right to get to that point. Just learn from it. Exactly. So yeah, that's a good point.
Exactly. So I think number one is visibility. Number two is humility, or just that, you know, maybe that vulnerability. I think thirdly would probably be, I think a lot of us in software development and in the industry, I think we actually create a glass ceiling for ourselves. You know, I think many of us we put these kind of constraints on ourselves in terms of our career. We sort of say to ourselves, oh, well, maybe I'll kind of progress in a couple of years,
Yeah.
And we almost think of it all as outside of our control. Well, but I've seen some absolutely wonderful people, special people that I've worked with, and they've progressed their career and accelerated through the ranks to leadership in a very short space of time. And they've done that because they haven't put those constraints on themselves. A lot of the time, it's only you that is putting those constraints on yourself. It actually, the glass ceiling doesn't exist. I think if you surround yourself with the right people, then actually it doesn't necessarily mean that the most technically proficient person is going to be the leader. Maybe actually they don't want to be. Maybe they don't have those leadership traits. But I think actually it's really important to back yourself. I think a lot more people in our industry should be, optimistic, and should be ambitious.
Yeah, great point. Great point. So let's just recap then. So first drawback for someone is
lack of visibility.
Yeah. Second drawback,
the reluctance to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And the third drawback is
the third drawback is giving yourself a glass ceiling.
Yeah. Perfect. That was almost like a little quiz then, wasn't it, for you? I didn't mean it to be. So then the second part of that question, and I think this is, again, we're going to have to cap this because this could go on. But I think it's going to be really interesting because, as I've said before, it's a very challenging market at the moment for recruitment in terms of, candidates locating positions, hiring managers having, candidates available at their disposal because we're still seeing, unfortunately, redundancies come about. However, companies are still struggling to source the right candidates, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I often think, and I see it weekly, certain factors are holding companies back in terms of attracting talent, retaining talent, and keeping up with the times. What would you say the top three ones are? And obviously, I'm just thinking top of my mind here that there's one that screams out at me straight away. But I think it'd be interesting to find out from, first and foremost, a leader, but also most recently a job seeker as well, what you think of top three things that are holding companies back at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. First thing is,
and may I just add, these views of James are his own. Full disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. They are definitely my own. Not that of Ollie, not that of my employer. So I think the first thing that's holding companies back from recruiting the best possible talent they could is being rigidly prescriptive.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that could be prescriptive in terms of ways of working. So, for example, remote, hybrid, on-site.
Yeah.
It could be prescriptive in terms of hours of working, or flexibility.
Yeah.
Or lack of. So I think the first one, is being rigid. It's absolutely fine. I think it's a good thing if companies want to encourage and nurture ways of working and a culture that is collaborative. Okay.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time it comes from a good place, Ollie, right? But I think the way in which it shows to an applicant, especially someone maybe who interviews for these positions or who gets offered these positions, I think it comes across as unnecessarily prescriptive.
Yeah. I like that.
Number two, I think I think actually it is a tough market out there at the moment. Okay. But I think it comes back to asking the organization, they've got to ask themselves, what do you really want? What do you want out of these candidates? What do you want out of this next role?
Yeah.
What are you trying to build? And I think if they ask that and they really ask themselves truthfully, they're going to try to recruit the people who are the best fit for that organization. Okay.
Yeah.
And that means less about the details, less about, again, I think it probably comes back down to prescription. So it could be very rigid prescriptions around, experience in a certain tech stack. It could be, or the tech stack itself. It could be around desirables or something, that, people, that getting the right people is most important. And I think that fit probably must come from culture. So, instead of focusing and concentrating firstly on the details of the skills, let's actually flip it around on its head. Let's actually think, what, here are our values as an organization. These things aren't going to change. Okay. This is the way in which we want to show up and act. Okay. If this resonates, with our kind of, applicants, that's great. There's synergy there. Let's start from that place. Whereas I think actually, the best organizations or the organizations who are recruiting the best talent are more pragmatic. They are far more pragmatic about, tick boxes.
Yeah.
They understand, and it comes back to what we've been talking about, for the last 20 minutes, Ollie. They understand that actually it's where somebody's going, it's how they're able to learn, it's how they're able to adapt, it's their approach, it's their mindset. That's the most important thing. That's the value, especially now, especially in the world of AI. It's less and less important how many years of, Python they've got, and it's far more important as to the values and their growth mindset.
Yeah. And just to add to that point as well, going back to, your foot into the industry, that is also something that is looked at. So, for example, education and background. Do they have a degree? Do they not have a degree? Why? Why does it matter? If they've got years of experience, is that not far greater than a degree with no experience? Like, I see it all the time. When you see roles go up by companies and they're looking for a mid to senior person, but they end up hiring a grad.
Yeah.
But I get it. I understand. Like, fair enough. That grad must have a lot going for them. But if that person is in that application pile that's got 5, 6 years of experience, good enough for the job, proven experience without a degree, how are they going to, like, hit, as far as hitting the ground running straight away goes, like, who's going to do that quicker?
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
And again, it comes back down to leadership. It all comes back down to leadership. I think that the strongest leaders I know in this industry would keep a job spec or a job application really simple. Really simple, and they would keep it broad.
Yeah.
They would absolutely understand that, the best people they can recruit are those who are willing to learn, who are tenacious problem solvers, and who are going to grow within the company. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen, people come on maybe as a front end developer with a very narrow skill set, but the best leaders have seen something in them, during interview, because of that broad application, because of the fact that they haven't been prescriptive over having a degree or years of experience or tech stack. They've seen something in them, and actually that person's then grown within a few years to be, a full stack polyglot developer who's, on track to become, lead dev. I see it.
And you know what? That person that has been given the opportunity to, get the foot in the door and prove themselves because they've had something shown with an interview to say, do you know what, you've got potential here, and I want to give you everything that we've got to be able to provide you with that success. That person stays at that company 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Longevity is there. Exactly. And I'm going to answer the final point for you, because I think you might say it, you might not, and you might say another good point, but I think this is also really important. Interviews are there to make sure that the company hire the best people and the right people. However, I've seen it before. I've seen it being done well and also not so great. the companies also need to sell themselves.
Yes.
The candidates, and I always say to candidates when they go into a final interview, for example, use that chance to ask questions and almost quiz them. If you get to final interview, you most likely have been quizzed from a technical point of view, and it's more so crossing the T's, dotting the I's to make sure that everything matches up. Use that time to quiz a company. It is so important for a company to sell themselves as well, why you should work with us, what can we offer you, what can we do, what do we bring to the table compared to A, B, C, D company on the high street. If you do that, you stand a better chance of securing better people and quicker as well. Otherwise, you know, that company risks being at the bottom of the pile of an applicant's list, because applicants these days have 3, 4, 5, 6+ applications.
Yes.
Everything goes into that. How many interview stages? If it's a tech task, if that company isn't really selling themselves, if there's a question mark over it, and if a company sells themselves at any point or at every point of the process, it allows that company to really stay ahead of other companies who most likely might be their competition, especially within the tech scene. For example, take Bristol, for example. Everyone's
Yeah.
a competitor.
Yeah.
We're not talking about just industry here. Everyone's a competitor because they're trying to find the same people. So I definitely add that to it. Whether would change that, I don't know. But I think that is so important for any company.
Ollie, I totally agree. So I think organizations must remember this is a two-way process.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. And I think sadly, it's maybe a hangover from kind of days gone by. It's a bit archaic now for companies and organizations to just think, okay, well, you know, it's the applicant who desperately wants this job, and it's for them to get it. Well, as you say, Ollie, no, that's not the case. It's a two-way. It's got to fit both ways, and I think that is very often forgotten. And so, to give you an example of this, I interviewed for an organization last year, and I got made an offer. Excuse me. So I got a contract sent through, and it was 3 or 4 stage interview for a senior technical position with the company. And the last stage interview was a chat that I had with a CTO. Okay, so C-suite exec, the highest rung you could get, the highest amount of leadership. And I got on a call with them and asked a few questions. Questions that really mattered to me. Questions actually about the contract. Now, it was quite sad actually, because I think the kind of feeling that I got from that C-suite exec was that, he was just sort of almost going through the motions a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Almost like, he didn't really need to, as you say, sell the company. In fact, there were lots of the things in my contract that he didn't really know anything about, nor seemed to have much interest in. And that, for me, told me a huge amount, a massive amount. And I thought, actually, I don't think this is a fit. I really don't. And what went from what should have been for the organization a formality, that was just a very final tick box. That should have been a formality. And actually, I declined the position on that basis.
First impressions count. And I presume they might have been back to the drawing board at that point, and the time wasted through that process all boils down to that final stage. You're right; it's an opportunity for a company to really sell themselves to the individual, because that is their sort of final interview as well.
Reassurance. We want reassurance as applicants. These are really important things. These are it's our livelihood, it's our job. It affects an awful lot. And I think, organizations, what we want from them maybe at the time is that reassurance that, okay, that, because this is a huge decision for people. So I think that's also something that I think organizations need to be mindful of.
Yeah. Some great points there. And I think, I'm excited to dig out these points from this podcast, because I think a lot of individuals and potentially companies can learn from it. But it's good to raise awareness of this for job seekers right now, and also potentially companies that are soon going to be looking for hiring that right person. So to sort of finish off, 10 years ago, if you could do that differently, if you could restart your career in tech, what's one piece of advice you'd give to James Cullen 10 years ago?
You've got far more ability than you think you have.
Short and sweet. Got to expand on that.
I think a lot of us are kind of our own worst enemy, our own worst critic. Yeah. And I think that goes for everyone in every industry. I think many of us are. And I think many of us underestimate our own ability, be that, in our career, in our performance, in whatever that may be. And that's to our detriment, Ollie. I think, and I really admire what you're doing. You've grabbed life by the horns. You're running your own organization, your own company, and I think that's an incredibly bold thing to do. And it shows that you back yourself. And I think there comes a point for us all in our careers at different times, be that to go for promotion, to move organization, to set up on your own. I think there comes a point whereby actually you've got to ask yourself that question: do I back myself? And I think the answer should always be yes. It should always be yes.
Wow, James, a monster of an episode this is. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on. I think a lot of points here that can really go a long way. So yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Ollie. It's been an absolute joy.
Hey, Ollie here. Thanks for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get involved in an upcoming podcast, just simply get in touch. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share within your networks.